So I want to talk a little more about the history of capitalism as it pertains to the history of baseball. Because the two are so fundamentally intertwined, and much of what we understand as capitalism today was engineered in earlier parts of Western civilization, particularly feudalistic Europe, but has become increasingly and exponentially more efficient, profound, and even popular in modern America. So much of what we experience as world capitalism today, global capitalism today, is the blueprint and template explicitly developed in the United States of America, particularly through plantation slavery, particularly through the genocide of the native people, and through extreme states of indentured servitude, including Chinese immigrants on the railroads, Mexican laborers in the Bracero program, and European immigrants in the factories and the mines of the Northeast. So I'm thinking about how to connect this, right? Because I read this great article earlier by Dr. Stacy Patton on the neuroscience of hunger and obedience in America. And I'm talking about this in 2025 with the current, as she describes it, biological warfare against the American population with the closure of SNAP benefits. This is the fall of 2025 as we hinge toward October 1st. We're looking at, as she describes it as an act of warfare, which I 100% agree with, and I think that's the foundation of modern industrial capitalism, which itself is fascistic and fascism, particularly when driven to extremes, when it exists in a state of pseudo-political neutrality. And what I mean by pseudo-political neutrality is that people believe that their coercion is their consent, and that acts of extreme political warfare, such as starvation and violence, are occurring in foreign countries to extract their labor and their resources, such as the history of colonialism, that convinces the local or the regional population of a kind capitalism. And again, to discuss feudalistic Europe and the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade in the 1500s, we are not talking about a kind political, social, or economic system. We're talking about a political, social, and economic system that functions entirely off of control, enforced scarcity, manipulation, and political violence through acts of engineering hunger and threats of physical violence. So this is I would just describe it fundamentally as a thuggishness. And this, to me, the thuggishness or the thuggish nature of capitalism, it's a fantastic term because it takes us directly into everything that we've been discussing, particularly in terms of the early modern baseball, gambling, control of the owners over player destinies. We're talking about the scrip that mining companies would give the miners, and that they would have mining towns themselves, and what that means in terms of control and manipulation and power. We are talking about baseball as a culture that emerges from a hyper-consolidated and consolidating power construct, which is early modern and modern American civilization, as a perfection of capitalism and a perfection of the capitalistic model, that modern capitalism doesn't emerge until industrial America, in my personal opinion. We're talking about a different form, a more perfected form of capitalism than is described by Marx just several moments and several decades before. And so what I really want to tap into here is how baseball interfaces with the development of this system, because this is a system of profound cultural violence and colonial violence, and we almost see baseball as an outlet, which again is democratically constituted, as in the people who are playing and participating and viewing the sport en masse are the proletarian class. These are the people who are selling newspapers in New York City. These are the people who are sitting on their porches in a sharecropping farm in Missouri and watching Dizzy Dean pitch. These are people who, growing up like Satchel Paige in Mobile, Alabama, are playing with any scrap of object or item they can get their hands on that resembles a bat or a ball. Crumpled up newspapers, nuts, right? Anything and everything, stones, rocks, sticks. This is the concept of stickball. And I read a really great, it was a really great piece. It was actually on Johnny Logan when I was doing the last article. He was a child of Eastern European, I believe maybe Russian immigrants, and they came to the United States, and they ended up settling right around the Pennsylvania-New York border. And at one point, he's going and he's spending his school days looking through a knothole into Yankee Stadium and watching Joe DiMaggio play and just being enraptured by Joe DiMaggio. And when I'm reading Stacey Patton's article, this is just foundationally true about what empire does, what American empire does, and how it manipulates and controls and violates its population to get them to submit to its practices, which again is an economic practice of control, enforced scarcity, and labor manipulation to get the population to do the bidding of the civilizational actors or the empire actors. And this is an enforced, as she says, political theater. This is a series of actions that are being taken, and they can be framed however they want to be framed by the dominant apparatus. But these are systems of political control, organizing people to get them to act in a certain way. This is what power is. This is how power functions across scales. And so you have baseball, which for a young Johnny Logan, as an immigrant in the United States to a poor family who they end up cobbling together enough money to open up a small neighborhood grocery. Baseball becomes a way of life. And this is what, again, I'm bringing it back to this because we've been so metaphysical lately. We've been so profound in some ways, right? I mean, discussing these massive existential and cosmological features and how baseball intertwines and culture intertwines and connects. And that's powerful from a philosophical standpoint. But this project has always been a philosophy of the streets, even just in how it's conducted, through the oration, through casual speech, through direct speech, even when the language becomes complex. Because what grounds us and what grounds me is when I look at a baseball card or a baseball photo or I look at baseball history, it's a history of the streets and it's a history of the common person. It's a history of the poor black man growing up in the American South and Jim Crow. It's a history of Rube Foster, whose parents were slaves, and he creates one of the most important cultural artifacts in American history, perhaps world history, with the beautiful aesthetics and practice of Negro League baseball. It's simultaneously its hardships, but also its profound victories. We're talking about Stan Kovaleski, the immigrant who had never set foot out of Shamokin, Pennsylvania, who labored in the coal mines and becomes a Hall of Fame pitcher with his heroics in the 1920 World Series. We're talking about a history, and baseball has obviously changed. It has changed so much in the past 70 years, since the 1950s. Which to me is the death of early modern baseball when the Giants and the Dodgers leave New York City. And we enter modern, or we enter late modern baseball. So how I want to tie this together is to say, you have the emergence of baseball, which is to say the emergence of meaning, in a civilization that is perfecting fascism. And this is not a hyperbolic statement. Because in perfecting capitalism, it's perfecting fascism. These two things are inextricable. And all that fascism is hyper-accelerated capitalism. And we discussed this in terms of the consciousness revolution. So you have these two forces, and it may have sounded like I was glorifying the evolution out of humanity in the previous essays. This is kind of like the futuristic mode of culture and the vision of culture that is elucidated, I think, particularly by the Russian visual artists, I'll say, in the early 1900s and the 1910s. And it's no mistake that this is occurring in Red Revolution Russia. Because there's a catching on, and this is one of the kind of early modern revolutionary movements. Again, it's against the Tsarist regime, and it's the introduction of Leninist and Trotskyist policies and ideas, which are communalist policies. It's a fighting back against the caste system established by the Tsar, as in empire. And this is a consciousness stage of revolution, again articulated by Mayakovsky, who says that there must be a spiritual revolution, as in an awakening to the true nature of the human being within the cosmos as a grand whole. And this is what we've been discussing. And this is what I'm connecting. I'm bringing that spiritual revolution into the political sphere. And the way that it happens is through the cultural artifact of empire, which reveals empire. And it's out from under this suppression that joy and possibility emerges. And this is, again, quite simply the history of baseball, even in the practice of baseball, which is a continuous and constant labor struggle, which is both racialized and a class consciousness within those who own and operate the machinery, which is to say, quote-unquote, the means of production of baseball itself, such as Charles Ebbets and the historical owners of baseball. This, again, is a power system of economy, which is economizing play. And this is a direct mirror to American civilization itself and the constriction and consolidation of life into a system of extraction. So you have these two forces, right? And I kind of want to elucidate it like this. You have the Heraclitean play, the child at play with colored balls, and then you have this hyper-consolidating consumptive force of the engine of, I would almost say that the cosmic consciousness, which I would describe it actually as Maxwell's demon, which is a great example, but also the Platonic demon, which is to say the monstrous force of consumption, which is thermodynamic and metabolic, which has no purpose other than to consume and reproduce energetic forms. It's a digestive mechanism. I actually wrote about this when I was very young. It's just funny how it always comes back. I wrote about American capitalism being the metaphor came later. I was calling it kind of this hungry creature or hungry beast, and the metaphor of the Moloch from the film Metropolis, the 1920s film, is one that stays with me to this day by Fritz Lang. And it's no coincidence that this movie happens in 1927. It's created in 1927. Especially in Germany, because this is the understanding, this is the implicit knowledge, right, as fascism is hitting in Germany due to the profound economic catastrophe post-World War I, and the power vacuum which is being filled by this far-right consequence of Hitler making this promise to restore Germany to its proto-native glory, right? The glory of its ancient days, right? restore the Volk, right? To restore the zeitgeist of native Germany. So this is all conditional upon economy and economics. And this is where we have the grace here and the possibility of entering into this really profound transdisciplinary dialogue, because we can jump from the cosmological to the economic and have a real understanding of enforced political scarcity by nature of thermodynamics and the thermometabolic mechanism of the human body, and relate that back to Stacey Patton and the essay Starving You is the Point, the neuroscience of hunger and obedience in America. And she's talking about enforced starvation as it occurred on plantations and through colonialism as a way to govern, right? As a way to control and suppress and oppress populations, creating enforced obedience by fear of the removal of food. So she says this is a dysregulation of the nervous system, and you don't have to police the mind because biology will do it for you. She's saying this is an undercutting of ideology, which again I absolutely agree with, because we have to look at the foundational mechanisms which organize the human being: food, shelter, water. And again, this is the Newtonian. This is the revolutionary in the sense of revolving. It's a consistency. It's the sense of a stabilization, a safety in repetition, which is fundamental to human existence. It's that the reliability that the food, the water, the shelter, the stability, that there will not be, you will wake up and there will not be a fear of violence, right? And that you'll be able to eat and drink and have a safe place to sleep, right? And so this is what any real civilization prioritizes, is creating these conditions, right? And so anything outside of that is a control mechanism. It's a mechanism of creating a system of power in which those essential, which is to say life-giving and life-sustaining resources, are withheld to control people's behavior, to manipulate them. And this, of course, is just quite simply capitalism. So to connect this back to baseball is that you have, as we've discussed with Dizzy Dean, Satchel Paige, all of these individuals, Kovaleski, Grove, Ed Walsh, these people who had nothing. They are victims of capitalism. They're trodden underfoot into this machine, this Moloch, which is consuming them. It's consuming their labor in the factories, in the mines, in the fields. And what baseball represents, and this is what's so important about culture, it's the great and grand paradox of culture, is that it's an ulteriority which can exist as a sphere of influence, an imaginative sphere of influence, a theater, so to speak, which can and does combat the political theater of human history, which is a theater of exploitation, control, manipulation, and abuse. So the theater of human history is a theater of colonialism and empire, suffering and violence. But what culture presents us with is a greater theater, the possibility of a greater theater. And this is the idea, I believe, articulated by, it's actually Terence McKenna, I believe, that Terence McKenna talks about the meme as a way of creating an idea which is more substantial, which is more true, which is more felt to be true, more intuitively true, that people can latch onto. So when we talk about capitalism, it's a system of belief. It's the belief that capitalism is the way of life. It is the way of existing. And thus, it is a system of behavior which is held up by belief and by this principle of faith. And in this way, it's deeply religious. So this is the push and pull of nature. This is the push and pull of nature between imaginative states, which in turn are the creation of human being circumstances. And this is the anthropological in relationship to the cosmological. Because there is the thermodynamic body. There is entropy. Right? This is the basic foundational principle. There is gravity. There is electromagnetism. Right? There is astrophysics. These are the fundamental undergirding principles which organize physical existence. There is the genome. There are the hormones. There are the synapses. Understanding those fundamental physical principles, anything beyond that is imaginary. Anything beyond that is cultural theater, which is utilizing, sometimes weaponizing, sometimes even elevating those basic foundational conditions and impulses and existences towards different spheres of imaginary locality. This is the history of the theater and the history of cinema just as much as it is the history of political action, the history of political revolutions, in that anything beyond those basic physical and astrophysical and biological circumstances is a political theater. It's a psychological and cultural theater of meaning and being in time. So this is what we're dealing with when we're dealing with, as Patton puts it, the intersection of culture and politics with the body, with neuroscience. Because we're looking at this foundational rhythm which must necessarily exist. Anything outside of the active creation of that is not civilization, it's war. So we cannot call anything outside of the creation of that essential regular establishment of food, water, shelter civilization, because it's the absolute bare minimum for a community or for a culture to have those resources at hand. So you have this continued reinforced scarcity and violence against a population, which is the civilizational government at war with its constituents. And what culture does and can do, right, conscious culture, or culture that has a imperative to create and establish community, and community particularly and especially through play, is that it can create human relationship and subvert control mechanisms, social system mechanisms of oppression and abuse and manipulation and violence, which are themselves the history of the political sphere ad nauseum. And this is really all we've been talking about with baseball, because as great as it is for baseball to be this grand cosmological or metaphysical revelation of the conditions of play as the universal, we then have to integrate that metaphysical knowledge into practical, physical, cultural, and political knowledge, which is to say a real practice, a sustainable practice to create better, more fulfilling human life. And so much of what Patton is talking about in this article, strategic cruelty and the dismantling of the social safety net born from the New Deal and Civil Rights era, is to collapse any sort of meaningful culture. And to substitute meaningful culture, as in real communal participation, which is always necessarily humanistic and gathering around play, with industrial culture, which is to say culture that is created and distributed to reify the ideological and nervous system imperatives of empire. And this is what baseball in many ways, to me, has become. It's become a weaponized artifact of wealth and power. It's an industrial artifact now of extreme sums of money being circulated as an institutionalization of the very thuggishness from which it was born and indelibly has roots in. The gamblers and figures like Al Capone, who was very famously a Cubs fan and had a great relationship with the great Cubs catcher Gabby Hartnett. The 1919 Black Sox World Series and the scandals of gambling in early modern baseball. These are all emerging from the political circumstances of the most impoverished, the most diminished in American civilization, who fought for a place in baseball from a position of survival. Through created fear, scarcity, and pain, which was attempted to be at least somewhat balanced by the work of FDR and the New Deal, and then furthermore in the 1950s with the creation of significant social systems for education. The initiative by the Black Panthers for the free breakfast for school children, which became institutionalized in American civilization. And this is the real fight, right? It's a humanistic fight to create and establish the foundations for a real civilization. And so we can't really describe anything that's previously existed as civilization. But what culture can do, especially culture from the ground, and baseball is a culture from the ground. It's a culture that was created democratically through experimentation and innovation, through those who were playing and are playing, creating and innovating the rules and constructs and participating at a ground level. This is why I so deeply appreciate the concept of like the knothole gang or the street ball game. Because what these are democratizations of baseball and baseball history. They're not institutionalizations as in economizations. And whenever we're talking about economizing a phenomenon or a system, we're talking about accelerating it toward fascism as a model, which is the abolition of the human being and a replacement of the human being with a empty labor container, which is being controlled and systematically destroyed, as in emptied out, of the nervous system, of the body. And this is what the philosopher Artaud, the French philosopher Artaud, in the early to mid 20th century in France expresses explicitly as a lived and felt experience. He's experiencing a death of life viscerally in a cultural empirical mode, which is actively gutting out and destroying the human being politically. And so when you have Satchel Paige in Mobile, Alabama, dedicating his entire life to baseball, all he wants to do is play baseball. You have a man and a child and a boy who has committed himself entirely to what he perceives as a deeper truth, and Heraclitus would agree, is a deeper truth of play, out from under the profound political violence and suppression of his time, which is reified in the fact that he cannot become a Major League Baseball player until he's in his 40s. And furthermore, when he's inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1971, he's placed in a separate wing with Negro Leagues players, a segregated wing in the 1970s. So we have to think about this in terms of the possibilities a real radical communal culture can bring. Because that culture in practice, as a resistance model, is a way of organizing collectively out from under empire and removing this machinic hand, right? This puppet hand from that which controls biological destinies, which is to say food, water, shelter, physical safety, and creating social conditions at the ground level and on the ground level in terms of a real grassroots politics, which make possible the dignity of human life among each and every one of us. And I discuss this so much with baseball, particularly Cuban baseball, because this is the function of an ethic of play in communal space, the function of an ethic of play in cultural and social space. It's to establish those connections. It's to create the sense of community and functioning together and being together, and thus supporting one another. It is not to continually and further fragment community through industrial social governance, which is to turn the human being into a labor machine for the power of a select few who are pulling those strings. And this is the industrialization of baseball as well. This is simultaneous. It's occurring in the cultural artifact of American civilization, just as it's occurring in and as American civilization itself. This is a power consolidation that is being attempted here. And to return baseball to its true grassroots origins, the singing, the dancing, the food, the music, and the game, that is, to me, the roots of modern baseball, as in an integrated game in Cuba at the outset of 1900, is to create the real foundational conditions for civilization, which is to say collective communal engagement and the upliftment of the ecosystem of community itself, through the establishment of the basic necessities, but furthermore, through the creation and reaffirming of culture as community, as a political and social practice. So that's what I got. I'll catch you on the next one.